On May 16, 1994, Vladimir Putin, then deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, guides Prince Charles on a tour of the city. The photo captures the future Russian president in a secondary, protocol-driven role, decades before becoming the world's most controversial leader, still a minor official in post-Soviet Russia. George Carlin is arrested on May 27, 1972, after performing his famous monologue, 7 Words You Can Never Say on Television Live. The deliberately blasphemous and provocative routine pushed the limits of free speech and would lead in 1908 to a landmark U.S. Supreme Court case on obscenity in broadcasting. The first officially recorded interracial marriage in Mississippi took place in 1970, 3 years after the Supreme Court's 1947 ruling in Loving, Virginia, struck down anti-miscegenation laws. The photo of the couple captures the courage of 2 people who broke legal and social barriers in one of the country's most deeply segregated states. General George Patton is photographed in North Africa in 1943 during the North African Campaign, in a colorized image that enhances his imposing posture and the arid tones of the desert. Patton, one of the most brilliant and controversial American commanders of World War II, was about to lead the Allies to victory in the region. A photo from around 1990 shows Daft Punk members Thomas Bangalter and Guy Manuel de Homem Christo performing live without the robotic helmets that became their signature look from the 2000s onward. The rare images of the duo before they embraced anonymity are a precious document of the French pair's pre-iconic phase. The author's great-grandmother, born in 1899, appears in a photograph the family shares with pride, despite never having had the chance to know her in person. The image of a woman who lived through world wars, pandemics, and technological revolutions carries the full weight of a life the author can only imagine. In 1944, after the liberation of France, a French woman has her head publicly shaved by civilians, accusing her of collaborating with the Nazis during the occupation. The brutal and humiliating practice of shearing women was widespread in liberated France, and often reflected personal grudges more than actual documented crimes. Neil Armstrong's family gathers to watch the launch of the Apollo 11 mission in July 1969, the flight that would carry their son, father, and husband to the surface of the moon for the first time in human history. The mixture of pride and anxiety on their faces captures the emotional weight of a feat that was simultaneously magnificent and terrifying. An actual photograph of Albert Einstein during a lecture on the theory of relativity in 1922, likely at Kyoto University in Japan during his trip to the East. The image records the genius in full intellectual mode, with the board covered in equations and the posture of someone explaining ideas that transformed physics forever. A Palestinian teenager offers a souvenir to female Israeli Defense Forces soldiers in Jerusalem in 1967, shortly after the Six-Day War. The unexpectedly cordial scene between civilians and soldiers at a moment of enormous political tension is a reminder that everyday humanity always coexists alongside conflict. The author's grandmother poses alongside John Candy, the great Canadian actor and comedian, in August 1988. She worked as a secretary at the accounting firm that managed the actor's finances. The casual encounter with one of the most beloved figures of 1980s comedy became one of the family's most treasured memories. Jane Mansfield, one of the biggest sex symbols of American cinema in the 1950s, smiles surrounded by a pink toy elephant at her birthday party in the 1960s. The exuberant and unusual scene captures the extravagant and fearless personality of an actress who lived and died at an amplified scale in everything she did. The author's mother appears in a 1972 photo, voting for the first time in a presidential election in Indiana, Pennsylvania. The image captures an important civic right, the first time one exercises the right to vote, with all the seriousness and enthusiasm of someone who fully grasps the weight of that simple democratic act. In 1963, photographer Richard Avedon photographed William Casby, born in 811, at the age of 106, a man who had lived as a slave. The close-up portrait, hands clutching his hat, was accompanied by a philosophical caption, "Born in Slavery," one of the most powerful photographs in the history of American memory. Jim Carrey, at 19, displays in 1981 the creative and absurd method he used to hitchhike, likely a sign, a costume, or a comic trick that already revealed the genius for physical comedy and improvisation that would make him one of the greatest comedic actors in the history of American cinema. Betty Robinson, Olympic champion of the 100-meter sprint in 1928, survived a plane crash and was mistakenly declared dead, spending 7 weeks in a coma. She spent 2 years learning to walk again and returned to the 1936 Berlin Olympics to win a gold medal in the relay, in one of sport's most extraordinary comeback stories. Ronald Reagan removes his baseball cap during a public farewell after leaving the presidency, revealing a partially shaved head, the remnant of a recent surgery, the casual and human gesture of the former president who shaped the 1980s with his conservative politics and cinematic charm, is curiously intimate. The author's mother appears in 1976 alongside her high school dance partner, and displaying a magnificent afro that visually defines the era. The photo captures African-American aesthetics in the 1970s at their peak, the hairstyle as a political, aesthetic, and identity statement that defined an entire generation in America. The author looks back at 1965 with nostalgia and good humor. He was 21, had a brand new Mustang, and thought he was incredibly cool. The photo, likely him leaning against the car in his youth, is the kind of image anyone who ever had a beautiful car in their youth recognizes, the delicious arrogance of not yet knowing how good you have it. A photo from August 1942 records women learning to shoot at Roosevelt High School in Los Angeles, California, during World War II. The civilian military training program, which included women, reflected the total mobilization of American society in support of the war effort at a moment of enormous national vulnerability. In 1996, the author worked at 18 in a used CD store, the kind of job that defined the alternative youth of an era when the physical CD was the center of music culture and used record shops were places of discovery, slang exchange, and identity formation among teenagers building who they were. A young woman smiles shyly during a May Day parade in Ukraine around 1968 during the Soviet period. May Day parades were obligatory political mobilization events in the USSR. But the image of the girl with her flowers and festive clothes transforms the event into something simply and unexpectedly beautiful. Green Day appears in a photo at Woodstock 1994, the festival born as a celebration of hippie idealism in 1969, and now hosting a generation of punk and grunge. The band's performance, which ended with Billy Joe Armstrong getting hit with mud thrown by the crowd, became one of the most entertaining legends of 90s rock. During the Liverpool Blitz of 1941, two little sisters bravely rescue their teddy bear from the rubble of their bombed home, carrying it in a toy pram. The image of two children responding to the destruction around them with innocence and quiet determination is one of the most moving portraits of British civilian resilience. The author appears in 1990 playing with dinosaurs, alongside his great-grandfather, who he reveals to be Orville Redenbacher, the legendary American popcorn producer who became one of the most recognizable faces in U.S. television advertising. The loving domestic photo of a great-grandpa on the floor playing with his great-grandson is truly charming. A soldier of the 12th Black Armored Division, one of the segregated black combat units of the American Army, poses alongside captured German prisoners in April 1945. The irony of a man fighting for a country that segregated him at home while sending him to liberate Europe is both profound and deeply painful. The author's stepfather performed all of the rigging and flying work for Jamie Lee Curtis in the action scenes of the film True Lies in 1994. He appears in a photo alongside the actress, demonstrating that behind every spectacular scene there are dedicated professionals whose contributions rarely receive the public recognition they deserve. The representative of Papua New Guinea at the United Nations appears in a 2017 photo in New York wearing full tribal attire, feathers, body paint, and traditional adornments. The image of a diplomat at UN headquarters in ancestral dress is one of the most powerful contrasts between global modernity and indigenous cultural identity. Dave Chappelle and Carrie Elwes appear together in a 1993 photo, when the future king of American comedy was still relatively unknown, and the actor from The Princess Bride was at the peak of his fame. The unlikely encounter of the two in their youth is one of those snapshots that time transforms into a genuine historical rarity. A mother and her daughter make faces and funny gestures for the camera around 1900. At a time when photography was still a formal and rare event, and most people posed rigid and serious. The naturalness and joy of the two in front of the camera reveal a closeness that transcends any era without losing any of its charm. A photograph from April 21, 1990, taken in Siakovo, shows children with radiation syndrome hospitalized in a ward, victims of the long-term consequences of the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. The disturbing image is a reminder that the human cost of the nuclear catastrophe was not limited to the moment of the explosion itself. A simple photograph from 1925 carries only the dedication in memory of Father, a quiet and touching tribute to someone who is gone, whose only remaining visible trace is this image. The absence of any further explanation transforms the photo into a minimal and profound monument to the filial love that persists beyond death. Rosemary Kennedy, daughter of businessman and politician Joe Kennedy, poses alongside her father around 1935 in a photo that predates decades of family tragedy. Rosemary, who had intellectual disabilities, was subjected to a disastrous lobotomy ordered by her own father in 1941 and spent the rest of her life institutionalized. Olga Chikova, niece of writer Anton Chekhov, became Adolf Hitler's favorite actress, and at the same time, according to Soviet archives, a USSR intelligence agent. She allegedly participated in plans to assassinate the Führer while dining with him. Her double identity is one of the great unsolved mysteries of World War II. Tony Hawk, the legendary skateboarder who revolutionized vertical skating and would become one of the most recognizable personalities in global sports, appears in a 1980s photo at a local skate park, still in the early stages of his career. The image captures a talented young man who had no idea of the cultural impact he would have. The author's father appears in a 1980 photo with a look she describes as identical to that of actor Chris Pratt in his youth. Hair, mustache, clothes, and posture, all matching perfectly with the casual and laid-back aesthetic of the Hollywood star. The improbable visual comparison with a celebrity is always a little bit delightful. A photo from the early 20th century records a freshman at Pomona College in California being forced to participate in the weigh-in, an abusive and degrading practice in which the male football team forcibly measured the physical proportions of incoming female students. The image is a disturbing document of institutionalized harassment. A 1988 photo by photographer Ricky Flores captures a Nation of Islam protest in front of Trump Tower in New York, with signs proclaiming Trump is a sucker. The demonstration, decades before Trump became president, documents a long history of community resistance to the real estate developers' practices and conduct. A young Lucy Liu appears in a 1990s photo before becoming world famous as Ling Wu on Ally McBeal, and then as one of the Charlie's Angels. The image captures the Chinese-American actress in an early career phase, with all the presence and energy that would make her one of Hollywood's most versatile performers. British woman Iris Davis is photographed in Clapham, London, rescuing a cat with a homemade lasso from the rubble of a house destroyed by German bombing. She saved more than 600 animals during the war, a mission of quiet compassion she carried out alone among the ruins while the aerial battle continued overhead. The author and his younger brother appear in a 1991 photo shortly after both were adopted from Thailand. The adoption was originally only for the author, but the family found his brother living on the other side of the orphanage and brought him along too. The image of two brothers united by chance and by love is deeply moving. Members of the mob hide their faces behind hats and newspapers during the trial of Al Capone in 1947, or possibly of another mob leader, since Capone had been convicted of tax evasion in 1931. The almost cinematic scene of powerful men trying to hide from cameras is irresistibly comic. Grandmother Nancy appears on her honeymoon around 1949 near Capitan, New Mexico, in a Kodachrome photograph taken by the author's grandfather. The warm and vivid colors of Kodachrome transform the portrait into something dreamlike. The young bride in a Southwest American landscape, captured with pioneering photographic technology. In January 1921, supporters of the Republican and Democratic parties engage in a snowball fight in front of the United States Capitol in Washington. The absurd and delightful scene, a snowball war, as a literal metaphor for American partisan politics, is one of the most deliciously ironic images in political history. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, the two Washington Post journalists who exposed the Watergate scandal, appear watching together as President Richard Nixon resigns. The two men whose investigation sparked America's greatest presidential crisis watch the conclusion of the scandal they themselves helped bring to light. A photograph from the 1940s appears to show the pioneering use of a selfie stick, or some improvised support for self-portraits at a distance, decades before the accessory became ubiquitous in the smartphone era. The image suggests that the need to photograph oneself without help is as old as the camera itself. Crazy Bull, a Sioux warrior, is photographed in 1889 in a formal portrait that captures the dignity and strength of a man from a nation that had been systematically dispossessed of its lands in the preceding decades. The image belongs to the period when American photographers documented indigenous peoples with a mix of respect and voyeurism. Willem Dafoe appears in a 1981 photo, years before becoming one of Hollywood's most respected character actors, with iconic roles in Platoon, The Last Temptation of Christ, Shadow of the Vampire, and Aquaman. The image of young Willem with the intensity in his eyes that would make him unmistakable on screen is fascinating. The author's father digitized a large collection of old negatives and found this photograph of the family's great-great-grandfather, taken around 1920. The image, likely a studio portrait or an everyday scene, crosses generations to introduce a contemporary descendant to an ancestor he could never have known. German soldiers cross a Russian border, heading east in the summer of 1941, during the opening days of Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history, with nearly 4 million Axis soldiers advancing into the Soviet Union. The photo captures young soldiers who had no idea yet what was waiting for them. In 2012, a couple walking their dog in Northern California discovered 8 rusted cans buried on their property, containing 1,047 gold coins from the 19th century, valued at over $10 million. The treasure, nicknamed the Saddle Ridge Hoard, is the largest numismatic find in United States history. An iconic photo shows John F. Kennedy contentedly smoking a Cuban cigar, despite having signed the American embargo on Cuban tobacco. Historical accounts indicate he ordered aide Pierre Salinger to purchase 1,200 Cuban cigars the day before signing the embargo into law in February 1962. A young Mexican federal soldier says an emotional goodbye to his daughter on a train platform before heading to the front lines during the Mexican Revolution in 1915. The photo, taken by photographer Agustin Victor Casasola, is one of the most intimate and human records of a conflict that mobilized and tore apart entire families. Jonas Salk, the American doctor who developed the polio vaccine in 1955, refused to patent the discovery so it could be produced and distributed freely worldwide. When asked who owned the patent, Salk famously replied, "The people. Could you patent the sun?" He never profited from the invention that saved millions of lives. Queen Elizabeth II is photographed at the exact moment Marcus Sargent, 17, aims a revolver in her direction and fires 6 blank shots during the Trooping the Color in 1981 in the United Kingdom. The Queen barely flinched, controlling her horse with perfect composure, a striking portrait of royal self-possession under pressure. San Francisco's famous Cliff House, the hotel and restaurant built at the edge of the Pacific Ocean and which had survived multiple disasters, is photographed shortly before being destroyed in a devastating fire in September 1907. The photo captures the end of an architectural icon that had withstood decades of wind and waves. 2 years earlier, the author had posted on Reddit a photo his grandfather had taken of the Three Stooges at Yellowstone. Unexpectedly, a librarian at the park reached out through Reddit, having recognized the photograph, opening a historical and personal connection between a family memory and the national park's official archive. A photo records the wedding of Tetsunosuke Yamamoto, a Japanese man, and Maria de Cruz dos Santos, a black woman, in Curitiba, Paraná, Brazil, on an unspecified date. The image of an interracial marriage in Brazil captures the ethnic and cultural diversity that marks Paraná's identity, where Japanese and Brazilian communities intersected. An enormous line stretches in front of American movie theaters on May 25, 1977, the opening day of Star Wars. Nobody knew yet that this science fiction film with laser swords and space battles would permanently transform the film industry and create a franchise that would still be dominating the box office 5 decades later. San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge opened to the public in 1937 in a historic ceremony, and during the load test, the structure bowed unexpectedly under the weight of 200,000 pedestrians, causing panic among the engineers. The bridge held, but the incident revealed the limits of what had been designed for. Former model and war correspondent Lee Miller poses in Adolf Hitler's personal bathtub on April 30th, 1945, the very day Hitler committed suicide. The photo, taken by photographer David Sherman, was deliberately composed with the Führer's portrait visible in the background, a scene of deeply symbolic triumph. After the couple's first serious fight, the author's father apologized to his mother in a creative and unusual way. A series of Polaroid photos documenting his request for forgiveness in 1987. The spontaneous and romantic gesture from the father, whom the author described as the original OG of apologies, became one of the family's most beloved stories. Coal miners cram into a narrow cage elevator in a Belgian mine around 1900 in a space that barely fits their coal-blackened bodies. The image of dozens of men compressed together in silence brutally captures the reality of the industrial coal extraction that powered early 20th century Europe. The very first photograph ever taken of Black Sabbath is from 1968, when the band was still called Earth and about to change its name to what would become one of the founding groups of heavy metal. Ozzy Osbourne, Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward appear young and unknown, with no idea what they were about to create. The Star Wars cast poses together in 1980 during the filming of The Empire Strikes Back. Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher, and others alongside creators like George Lucas. The photo captures a group that had already changed cinema 3 years earlier and was about to cement one of the greatest sagas in entertainment history. A photo found by Syrian rebels in Bashar al-Assad's palace shows the dictator enjoying an afternoon by his private pool, an image that circulated widely as a symbol of a leader living in luxury, while his country descended into the civil war that would kill hundreds of thousands of people starting in 2011. Eileen Dunn, just 3 years old, sits on a hospital bed clutching her doll at Great Ormond Street Hospital in London after being wounded during a German air raid in the Second World War. Published in Life magazine, the photo became one of the most recognized faces of British childhood under the Blitz. Actor Lloyd Bridges, father of future star Jeff Bridges, appears alongside his young son in 1951. The warm and affectionate domestic photo is a portrait of the Bridges dynasty, one of the most enduring in American cinema, with father and son building solid careers in different decades, but each leaving a lasting mark on entertainment. Uncle Bernie appears in a 1972 photo after painting the house, covered in paint, clearly exhausted, but satisfied with the work. The unpretentious everyday scene is shared with warmth by a nephew who remembers his uncle with deep affection, transforming an utterly ordinary moment into a loving family portrait. A visual demonstration compares what $134 American could buy in 1918 versus 1945, revealing the severe impact of inflation driven by 2 world wars on the purchasing power of ordinary citizens. The image is a simple and striking economic document about how conflicts silently destroy everyday wealth. In 1962, the author lived through his first day of kindergarten with all the characteristic anxiety of a small child being separated from his parents for the first time. The photo likely captures a mixed expression of nervousness and curiosity, universal to anyone who remembers the first days of school, with a combination of dread and relief. A photograph from around 1863 portrays a Black American man with dwarfism, a rare historical document that combines 2 forms of marginalization rarely photographed together in the period immediately before or during the Civil War. The portrait reveals a man with a dignity and presence that transcends the labels of his era. The author's friend, known as Whole Wheat, proudly displays his original cassette tape of Bleach, Nirvana's 1989 debut album, in a photo taken around 1993. The independent record, made for just $606, was a true rarity before the Nirvana explosion, and owning the tape was a mark of genuine underground credibility. A 1913 British publication by Blanche Ebbett, titled Don'ts for Wives and Don'ts for Husbands, seriously lists the appropriate and inappropriate behaviors for Edwardian married couples. The historical document is both a primary source for the sociology of the era and a fascinating inventory of the prejudices of its time. The author's uncle is photographed in the 1970s in the middle of his oregano garden, a phrase that in the context of the 70s may very well be a euphemistic reference to the marijuana that many young people grew at home during that era of counterculture and experimentation. The deliberately vague image is intentionally ambiguous and funny. Adolf Hitler appears with two comrades and his mixed-breed dog, Fuchsel, Little Fox, a terrier he rescued from no man's land during World War I after the animal chased a rat between the trenches. Hitler became so attached to the dog that he reportedly cried when Fuchsel went missing in 1917. In 1983, in Clearwater, Florida, exotic dancers were arrested and charged with violating nudity laws during a performance. The charges were dropped after a live demonstration before a judge that their costumes provided adequate coverage, creating one of the most unusual and comic scenes in the history of American jurisprudence. Two Iraqi men carry a weakened and ill mother in their arms toward a hospital in 2003 during the American invasion of Iraq. The image of sons physically carrying their mother through a war that was dismantling the country's healthcare infrastructure captures with raw humanity the invisible civilian cost of the conflict. A police officer stops traffic in a busy street in 1925 so that a cat can safely cross while carrying a kitten in her mouth. The unlikely scene of a law enforcement officer halting cars and pedestrians for such a small and tender reason is one of the most adorable and improbable images in the history of American photojournalism. Future First Lady Lady Bird Johnson appears with her household employee Alice Tittle, the woman who, according to legend, gave the young woman the nickname she would carry for life. The photo reveals the close and affectionate bond between the two that helped shape the personality of the future White House resident. A beautiful young Ukrainian woman appears in traditional dress in 1935, a photograph that was restored to reveal the colors and embroidered details of her costume with surprising quality. The comparison between the original photo and the restored version demonstrates how modern technology can return life and color to memories the years had washed away. The author appears at age 6 in 1992 at the base of the World Trade Center's Twin Towers in New York, the same towers that would be destroyed on September 11, 2001, when he would have been around 15 years old. The innocent image of a child standing before the towers carries the full weight of everything that came after. In 1944, during the liberation of France, African soldiers from the regiments of African hunters were ordered to remove their uniforms after being discharged from the French army, part of a deliberate policy of whitening the military forces before the victory ceremonies. The erased episode in French history was an act of institutional racism. Marilyn Monroe has a costume adjusted during the filming of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes in 1953. The behind-the-scenes image reveals the meticulous work of seamstresses and costume designers in constructing the glamour audiences saw on screen, the invisible art that transformed a woman into a cinema icon. The author shares with good humor her glamour shots taken at a mall studio in 1997, the specific type of photography studio that promised to turn anyone into a movie star. The result, she admits, was that she looks like a woman who just cashed in her husband's life insurance. The self-irony is pitch perfect. Dutch girls walk cheerfully alongside American soldiers to a celebratory dance after the liberation of the Netherlands at the end of World War II. The festive and relieved scene captures the moment when a generation that grew up under Nazi occupation finally celebrated freedom with the exuberance of those who had waited a very long time. A glass plate negative from around 1895 captures Helen Keller, deaf and blind since 19 months old, alongside her teacher, Anne Sullivan. Sullivan revolutionized education for people with disabilities by teaching Keller to communicate through touch, and the inseparable pair became one of the most powerful symbols of inclusive education in history. A behind-the-scenes photo from the set of Steven Spielberg's 1991 film, Hook, captures the atmosphere of one of the decade's most ambitious adventure productions. The film, starring Robin Williams as an adult Peter Pan, brought together a cast and crew who worked for months on a production of enormous scope and spectacle. The couple the author describes as the most stylish people I know appears in two photos, one from 1972 and one from 2019, nearly 5 decades apart. The contrast between the two moments, showing the same two faces aged but still together, is one of the most moving ways to show that love, when real, withstands time. A street scene in Pennsylvania in 1941 captures everyday American life on the eve of the country's entry into World War II, before Pearl Harbor, in December of that year. The apparent normalcy of the people, the cars, and the buildings contrasts with the global conflict that would draw the country into war within months. Model Milla Jovovich, future star of The Fifth Element and the Resident Evil franchise, appears on the cover of the Italian magazine Lei in 1987 at just 11 years old, 7 years after her family immigrated from the Soviet Union. The photo is a record of the extraordinarily early start of one of the most influential models of the 90s. The author found this 1989 photo in the family album, he and his parents arriving excitedly at the weekend cabin. The radiant simplicity of the image, cars loaded with luggage, satisfied faces, and the promise of days away from routine, perfectly captures the specific and irreplaceable happiness of family getaways. A photo shows the current pope, likely Francis before becoming pontiff, as a young priest, with a gentle and accessible expression that strikes anyone who sees it. The image of the future leader of the Catholic Church as a simple and humble clergyman humanizes the figure who would later occupy the throne of St. Peter. The author's grandparents appear in costume at a party in the early 1950s, likely a costume party or Halloween celebration. The image of the two young people enthusiastically dressed up evokes the ease and social creativity of a generation that knew how to have fun without technology and with a great deal of hands-on inventiveness. A historical image documents the Nanjing Massacre, the genocide committed by the Imperial Japanese Army against Chinese civilians and prisoners of war in the city of Nanjing between December 1937 and January 1938. Between 100,000 and 300,000 people are estimated to have been killed in one of the darkest episodes of the 20th century. The author's grandmother and great-grandmother are photographed in China in the late 1920s. The author explains that as an only child in a family that wanted a male heir, her grandmother had her hair cut short like a boy's to be raised as a son, a cultural practice tied to the preference for male children in Imperial China. An Absaroki mother, from the indigenous people of the American Plains, also known as the Crow, appears with her young child in Montana, United States, in 1908. The photograph, likely taken by Edward Curtis for his epic project documenting Native American peoples, captures a universal motherhood in a uniquely documented context. The last photograph of Lori Turney, taken on October 15, 1965, 3 days before his death in a helicopter crash in South Vietnam. Turney had an extraordinary story. He fought for Finland in World War II, then immigrated to the U.S. and became a U.S. Army Green Beret, serving under the name Larry Thorne. The author's father and his veterinarian mother appear in a 1959 photo with the pet lion the family raised for 2 years before returning it to the wild. The improbable image of a family posing with a young lion reflects an era when regulations around wild animals were far less strict than they are today. A photograph from around 1850 to 1860 portrays a Victorian woman with a gaze of disturbing and hypnotic intensity that challenges the modern viewer. At a time when long exposure times demanded total stillness, the woman's focused and penetrating expression seems to have been captured with deliberate and fully conscious intent.